Agriculture is foundational in our lives. The food we eat is a deep part of who we are, where we live, and how we connect with others. Contemporary agriculture is also a major contributor to climate change and a variety of environmental problems throughout where we live. Globally, agriculture represents nearly a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions, more than transportation. Of agricultural emissions, nearly two-thirds come from meat and dairy production. Over the past several weeks, we've talked a lot about food, how there are many ways to produce meat, some of which help the environment through regenerative practices, and how mass industrial methods, which represent nearly 96% of meat produced for consumption, carries enormous consequences for the laborers who raise and slaughter animals, the animals raised in horrific conditions, and the environment that suffers from the waste and chemical residues these plants produce. It's unsurprising that on nearly every list of things you can do to lower your carbon footprint, reducing or eliminating meat and dairy is usually top of the list. But that's a big ask, as we've talked about quite a lot. So today, we're talking about meat one more time, but instead of how it's produced, we're thinking about how we consume it, how it impacts our planet, our communities, and our bodies, and we're talking about that with food more broadly. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Before we jump in, I want to remind listeners they can catch up on episodes of Gulf Streams anytime on the Gulf Streams podcast, available on all major podcast streaming platforms. If you're enjoying the show, please like and subscribe, and tell a friend to help us connect others to our weekly environmental stories. Today on the program, we're speaking with Anita Jaisinghani, head chef and co-owner of Pondicheri here in Houston. Anita is a highly decorated chef. Her 2022 cookbook, Masala, Recipes from India, the Land of Spices, was nominated for a James Beard Award for Best International Cookbook, and she was nominated for a James Beard Award for the Southwest in 2012, 2017, and 2018, and a finalist nominee for Texas in 2022. Pondicheri won Best Indian Restaurant in Houston from the Houston Chronicle in 2020 and is consistently rated as one of the top restaurants in the city by the Chronicle. If you want to join in our conversation with a question today, please call 713-526-5738 extension 2. That's 713-526-5738 extension 2. Anita Jaisinghani, welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
So I'm really excited to talk with you today about food and the myriad ways that, of course, you as an incredibly prominent chef in the community are thinking about food. But I actually want to start off and go a step back, because something that I find really fascinating is before you became a chef, you were a microbiologist.
Yes, I was.
Can you tell us just a little bit about that? Because I mean, when I think of microbiology, the things that I'm jumping to are, microorganisms and these tiny things that affect us, but especially a lot of things that affect our health. And so, when I saw that, my immediate thought is, oh, this is someone who's been deeply interested in questions around health really your whole life.
Well, I did microbiology because I wasn't allowed to go to cooking school. It wasn't because I loved microbiology.
Fair enough.
But when I studied microbiology, I found it fascinating because, I worked as a microbiologist in Canada with this pathologist for a few years, and I found how bacteria grow fascinating. But, there was a time when I went to school where bacteria was considered bad, like all bacteria was like, they were either doing nothing for you or they were doing bad things to you. Fast forward to 2020s, or really the last 10 years, we talk about the microbiome, the virome, and we actually are just a host for bacteria. Our bodies have billions of bacteria, and so much more has been discovered since then that I sometimes feel like I want to go back to studying microbiology. And it has definitely helped me be a chef because I can think about cooking scientifically, not just aesthetically or taste-wise. So yeah, microbiology has, led me to food where I really wanted to be in the first place. But my parents didn't think it was a career that was worthy of our family, so no.
Well, I think you've probably proved them wrong at this point.
Yeah. Well, chefs weren't celebrated in India at the time. The culture was different. It's different now, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I find it not at all surprising in many ways that you have the science background, having eaten at Pondicheri Bake Lab multiple times, and thinking of the degree of precision in the food that you generate there and the kind of ideas that you're playing with. So it makes total sense to me, actually, that this is your background.
Yeah. I mean, it has certainly helped.
So I want to translate this a little bit to food. And so something that I've heard you talk a lot about, going back to when you ran Indica as well, a really fantastic restaurant here in town for 17 or 18 years.
Yeah, 16 years, yeah.
Yeah. Something that's really interesting is the way that you talk about the relationship between food and health. And so I'm curious if you want to expand a little bit on how you view food as a part of which certainly I think we're all very aware, what I eat matters to my health. But this is something you've been talking about and thinking about, and I think in the way that you source food, in the way that you imagine food as a part of culture is really significant. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that relationship.
So in the beginning, when I first started cooking, it was really important to me that the food tasted really good and it was beautiful. It seemed like that was my ruling guideline, that okay, it has to be beautiful, it has to be tasty, it has to be something that I had in my childhood. Now all those things were important, but I really didn't think about what it was doing to me. And I've naturally been a big meat eater, but going through my family life and seeing people around me with illnesses and all kinds of conditions I feel like people have now, even young people, it's not just older people. When I opened Pondicherry, when I opened Indica, I feel like my goal was completely on taste. And also I feel like I had more of an ego then. I wanted to show off, and it was like, oh, I can make the best food, or I can do this. And then I was like, hold on, this isn't about me. This is about what I can do from what I have here. So then when I opened Pondi, I became much more of how can I cook food that is grown here. Now, I was always going to a farmer's market, even from my first move into Houston, but I never really invested the time to get to know all the farmers, to get to buy food that is around me. Because one of the ruling principles of Indian culture is that if you eat what grows around you, that is the best form of immunity. Like your best immunity is eating what grows around you. And that's really a simple idea, but in India, it was the only way people lived, because farmers grew stuff and they ate what they grew and they sold their stuff to, cities, villages nearby. It's really after this whole transportation of this to there, that it became like you could get apples in the summer, or you could get things that didn't belong in that area. So I only grew up eating stuff that was around me. And I just didn't really appreciate it at the time. I wanted things that were far away. I wanted, you always want what you don't have. So it really came full circle to me when I opened Pondi, that wait, this is how I grew up and this is what I want to go back to. So then I began to really examine what is it that I can cook with around me. And that's what led me to looking at food that was local, that was seasonal. And Texas has great... I mean, it's the climate is kind of like, New Delhi, like India. So a lot of stuff grows here. Because I lived in Canada for many years before I moved to the U.S.
Very different climate
Very
from
different
India.
climate. You only had about 3 or 4 months of growing season.
Yeah.
And everything else was brought in. And that's understandable there. But in Houston, I didn't have to do that. And it's not that I wouldn't say that I'm serving everything that is local, but we really, really try. Like almost every farmer around here has my cell number, and they text me when they have something, and they know I almost never say no. That I'll buy whatever you can't sell, or you have too much off, or you want to offer me first. So
well, and I imagine that leads to some really interesting inventions happening in the kitchen.
Right, and during the pandemic, we started getting calls from farmers that said, "I just grew 400 pounds of fennel. Will you take it?" And I was like, oh my God. I mean, I came up with everything from a fennel pickle to fennel jam to fennel pizzas. And, we were closed then. We were only open for takeout in the beginning. But we canned and froze. And, processed, because I know these farmers needed to sell this. It was 400 pounds of peppers or eggplants, and we just took it all. So that was the year I really began to say, okay, oh my God, I have to find a way to. And I learned that I can do so much more with a vegetable than what is my standard in my brain. And I do have a very open mind with food. Like I'll go in directions that most people would never go. So it was fun to explore.
Well, I want that fennel pizza, so I'm gonna
Yeah.
come back and talk to you about that. But I think something that I find really exciting in a lot of what you're talking about is just, certainly we've seen a real turn towards appreciating locally grown food, that is significant not only exactly to support those local farmers and local foodways, but it also reduces a tremendous amount of waste. It reduces transportation costs.
Right.
As we think about these as systems of production, as we think about the health impacts, which is, a big piece of this, we've seen tremendous evidence for local food being, not only more sustainable, but actually better for us.
Right.
And so I find that so exciting to hear you talking about how important that role is. I'm also curious, though, because I know we've talked in the past a little about some of those experiences you had when you first got to the U.S. or maybe Canada from India, and the change in kind of quality and what was expected of food. I remember you talking about, your experience of chickens in particular.
Right. Even a banana. I'd never
Oh, wow.
seen a perfectly sculpted yellow banana. Grocery stores to me were the most fascinating things when I first came from India, because I'd never seen a grocery store so beautifully laid out and all the produce looking like they were pieces of candy. Like they looked so perfect. And I thought to myself, wow, we Indians are just so stupid. We don't know how to grow beautiful produce. These Canadians and Americans know how to grow. And I didn't realize that a lot of that was genetically modified. I just thought it was, they just had better seeds. I just didn't know. It was ignorance at the time. I was very young. And then I remember eating chicken or eating cauliflower and, wanting to love it. And I think making myself believe that this is better than what I had in India. And fortunately, I went back to India a lot. So I went back at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And I would eat my mother's crawny chicken. I'm like, why does this taste so good? Like, I know, and it's not because my mother cooked it. I knew it was tastier. And over the years, I figured out that this crawny chickens in India are the way the chickens were meant to be. And they're not pumped up with antibiotics and chemicals. And they don't come in a neat plastic. My dad had to carry the live chicken in a bag, clucking away. And my mother would, kill it in the backyard. But that chicken was something I'd never eaten here.
Absolutely. And so that brings up these larger conversations around that we've been having a series of conversations around the way that we create meat, in a recent conversation around pork in particular, the idea that pigs in the U.S. and now often globally are not even really, what we would think of as traditional pigs, or this new kind of industrial fabrication.
Right.
And certainly that carries over to chickens, which, something obscene, like 60% of chickens are now breast meat. Because we've just completely
bred them.
Exactly. Redesigned these animals. And I mean, I use that term rather specifically because we have tried to engineer animals in ways that is really quite shocking, but also exactly directly impacts taste and flavor and nutritional value. And we're seeing that in all of these number of health impacts, in a number of studies that have come out in the last few years. The series that we've been having around meat really grew out of one of my researchers who was very keen to talk about vegan and vegetarian diets, and really thinking about, if you go to one of these like carbon calculators, usually the top of the list item on there is like, well, just cut out meat and dairy. Which I'm sitting here and I can see you shaking your head.
It's not going to happen that quickly.
Exactly.
It's not. It's a great idea, but it's not.
And it's one of those things that exactly, I think it's really, I remember sitting with you at a kind of group of environmentalists all sitting around, and we were all kind of laughing at, several of us were trying to kind of avoid meat on what we were ordering, maybe a little bit out of peer pressure because it was a table that's, you're expecting a higher number of vegetarians, and then kind of talking to each other going, oh, I'm like 85%, 90%
Yeah.
veg. Like, but no one really wants to commit to it. I sit here, I'm from New Orleans, and like if the idea of you're going to take away my andouille sausage and my
Yeah.
redfish is just like personally painful in a deep and primal way, that, you know, food is how we connect so much to heritage and culture. And so I think, you know, one of the conversations that I had with this researcher is really, how can we think about better ways to consume meat, healthier ways to consume meat? What does meat reduction look like? We've seen tremendous statistics coming out of the World Health Organization around, you know, really eating more than a pound of red meat a week becomes carcinogenic.
Right.
You know, and so these various things. And so, you know, one of the reasons I was really excited to meet you and to talk with you a few months back was you've instigated Meatless Mondays at Pondicheri.
Okay, so I actually took that away. But
Okay.
let me
All right.
tell you why. So I started Meatless Monday about 10, 12 years ago.
Great.
We opened Pondicherry within a year we did that. I mean, people thought I was completely mad to do a
It's
vegetarian
ambitious
Monday.
in Houston.
I know, and we had a lot of pushback, and I did it over years. We took it away, put it back, and I finally have taken it away. And there's a reason why, because I don't want it to be, I don't want, I feel like the problem is so big that if on Mondays only I'm vegetarian or vegan, then I'm really saying that, well, the rest of the week, go eat all the meat you want. Also, I was developing recipes and dishes that I was saving for Monday, but then why can't people have them on a Friday? So I decided that I would just take away Meatless Monday, have meat every day, but really, and I've been inching the meat back on our menu since we opened, you know, a lot. Like we used to be like, I'd say 70% meat. We are now less than 50% meat, closer to the 40% range. I don't remember. We used to do, you know, our food has a lot of side dishes, so it's hard to value it exactly. But I would say we are like, you know, 2/3 vegetarian and 1/3 vegan. So
Yeah.
we have plenty of vegan food. And if I've developed a great recipe that I want to eat every day, why do I have to wait till Monday to have it? And that's also like condoning that, yeah, on Friday, go get your big steak, come back on Monday and eat meatless. It's like, we need to think about this every day. This is a daily problem, or like a very urgent, constant problem that, you know, what we're consuming is affecting our children, our grandchildren, and our environment.
Can you say more about that? Because I'm really curious to hear about how you first started thinking about meat as something we need to be really cautious about, and thinking about, you know, on this kind of larger scale of the environment, and when that first started occurring to you.
I mean, I feel like as an Indian, I've always thought about that. You know, in India, there's a lot of Indians are vegetarians.
Over a third of the country, which
Yes.
is by far the large. When you're talking about
Largest
1.5
population.
billion people,
Right.
you know, it's more Indians are vegetarian than the entire population of the U.S. by a large margin.
Right. And I think that once you really start becoming conscious of the fact that these are animals that you are killing and consuming, and what is it doing to your body, it's definitely, and I won't deny that, you know, the genie's out of the bottle. We've all eaten them, and we all love the taste of them. And I go through phases where I don't eat any meat, and I'll taste some. But I feel like when I opened Pondicherry, I really wanted to highlight vegetables. So I was trying to move meat. I guess my goal has been to move off the center of the plate. So I'm not saying don't eat meat, eat less meat. So, and having conversations like, well, stop eating meat. You know, you lose half the room, if not the entire room,
Yeah.
in Texas or really anywhere. Even in New York, people didn't
Yeah.
want to not eat meat. But if you say, well, you know, what if you ate a bit of meat with this? It's kind of how also the culture of Asia is. Like, look at the food of Thailand, Vietnam, India. They don't put a hunk of meat on a plate. Never. If it's even a meat curry, or it's a meat stir fry, or it's meat noodles, there's every part of the animal is used. They use different ways to process that. So, I mean, we ate meat growing up about 2 to 3 times a month. It was a special occasion thing. We didn't eat meat 3 times a day.
Yeah.
That was unheard of. And I never really got into eating meat 3 times a day. That to me was like too much. It was maybe once a day, or maybe 3-4 times a week. And now it's like maybe once a week. So it became like this consciousness change that we don't need to do this. And, you know, I knew it was bad for health. So that was another fear, that I need to figure out how I can cook food that isn't going to make me or other people sick or sicker.
Yes, I think that's so valuable, and it really directly connects into the series of conversations we've been having around how meat is produced and how it's changed culturally. And I would encourage listeners, please go check out the podcast. If you've missed some of those episodes, listen to any of the recent ones we've been doing around meat production and some of the really interesting history around how this has been produced. But exactly that kind of social change you're pointing out, that idea of normalizing daily meat consumption, multiple times a day meat consumption, whereas for most cultures historically around the world broadly, the idea of slaying the fatted calf, right? It was for a big feast day. It was for, if we have a really honored guest, that then we'll,
or a wedding, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
For these major occasions. It's not that, most societies were vegetarian. There are a handful, India being by far the most prominent example. But most cultures historically have eaten meat. Like it's just inaccurate to kind of sit there and be like, yeah, we're not meat like humans culturally like to eat meat.
Yes. Yes.
But the way we do that is very different. The idea of hunting and fishing for that supply versus going in and just buying, a giant pack of chicken breasts every day and only eating those chicken breasts, so that now we have this thing where, the vast majority of the industry is going to fabricating one body part. And so, I'd love to hear more about some of what you're thinking around with, using all of the animal. And oftentimes, not to go deep in the weeds on my own cooking practices, but, I was raised in the South, and I feel a little bit like a Southern grandma of old, where I'm like, I keep all the bacon grease because I will use that as a flavor enhancer.
Yes.
And that idea of, I think we've become far more attached to cooking at home in particular, but even cooking in restaurants, that, there's a kind of wastefulness around the cooking and consuming of meat in a way that makes a lot of this industrial processing possible.
Yeah. And, when the pandemic happened and we didn't expect the announcement that tomorrow you can't serve food anymore. I think it came like literally as a 24-hour warning or notice from the mayor. The restaurants had to close, and we had 300 pounds of chicken in our walk-in. And the first thing when my daughter said to me was, Mom, those chickens died for you. Don't let them go to waste. I was like, yes, honey, I got it. But it's true, they
it
did.
Is, yeah.
And of course, we found a way to, roast, freeze, get them sold somehow or used somehow. But that is the mentality that I feel if we all walk with a bit of reverence that, this is an animal that has, even if they were raised in a factory by a commercial factory, still it's an animal with a breathing heart. Think about it. So don't be so dismissive about what meat. And when people throw away meat, a couple of days ago, one of my cooks who's now become a manager was eating one of our thalis, and he left a bit of our lamb in there. And I'm like, why did you leave that? I could see him. He's like, oh, I was kind of full. And I said, you've become way too American. You discard that with way too much disregard. And he looked at me and he walked away. He came back. He goes, you're right. I would never have done that back home. He came from Guatemala. He goes, I would have never done that 5, 10, 20 years ago. And I'm never going to do that again. And I was just teasing him. I didn't expect him to pick up on that so quickly. But there is just a lack of respect and reverence for animals, for our planet, that food has led us to. Like, oh, I'm just eating something that came out of a package. Well, no, that was an animal once.
I think, yeah, I'm going to pause for 1 second just to say if anyone has a question or a comment they want to call in with, the number is 713-526-5738, option 2. That's 713-526-5738, option 2. I think that's, that's this really fascinating piece of this conversation to me, is that cultural side. And, I think a broader question there, because, I laugh, but your daughter's 100% right? She's, those chickens, and especially when we see images of like how chickens are raised and what the conditions of animal welfare are in these industrial settings, it is just heartbreaking. But there's a disconnect. There's this really big disconnect between, even when, we've had really shocking documentaries coming out for decades now about how animals are raised. And it's, this is not converted the entire population to this is appalling and we should rethink it, because at the end of the day, most of us want to be able to, have a chicken burger once in a while or whatever it is. And at the same time, we don't want that. We'll have a piece from our researcher Jaden in a little bit about the cost of meat and how it is that we can afford to consume so much meat and throw so much meat away. But I'm curious about how you're thinking of this connection to our food and where it comes from. And I mean, the fact that you started with this story around local farmers, but food is so personal, and I think there is this disconnect at the supermarket. So I'm curious if you'd like to talk a little about how we connect to it.
I mean, I write a weekly article for the Chronicle. It's a recipe column, and in that I do 98% vegetarian food. So I'm trying to show people that you can turn vegetables into your main course. It doesn't have to be a side dish. And and people think of vegetables as just the the riffraff around the meat, but it's not. It can be so much more. And I also think that what people don't realize is that it's not an all or nothing game. You can slowly pull back. So, for example, if you let's say make chili or you make ground chicken or turkey or beef in one of your dishes, whatever it is you make, you can throw in vegetables with it. So we, for example, when we grind our own lamb, we grind with that celery and mushrooms. I mean, we grind it like about 30% of our or 40% of our lamb is actually celery and mushrooms. Wow. So we end up, and you wouldn't know that. If you eat it, you will not know that. And we openly tell people, we're not trying to hide this. We're trying to show you that, hey, you can do this too at home. Throw the celery and mushrooms in your food processor, grind it up, and cook it with your ground meat. And it's actually going to be tastier than only meat, because the vegetables add fiber, they take on that flavor. So there are so many ways to let go. Like, okay, well, I'm going to eat meat, but I'm going to add more vegetables to it. I'm going to stop eating salmon. Like, for me, salmon was a big thing. I absolutely love salmon. It's my favorite fish ever to eat. But after reading about all the salmon, how terrible farmed salmon is, even the good farmed salmon is terrible. It has, they add food coloring to it. Even the and farm salmon, I mean, we need the salmon population to grow back, and someone has to stop eating salmon, and every restaurant can't be serving it, so we don't serve it, we don't eat it. Making little changes in my life has helped me understand that, okay, I can eat differently, I can live differently, and I'm going to feel better too.
I think that's such an important component of this and it's, it gets at this idea of, that cultural change of just even rethinking how we're building our plate, which is really hard because we're very attached to the foods we love. And, I remember I was actually at an event a couple of weeks back, and it was mostly some older folks who were there, and we, had a couple vegetarians and vegans. So I had arranged the catering for it and mostly arranged around a vegetarian diet. And, some of the older folks in the room were really not happy about that.
Yeah.
And were really, kind of like, and then they would try different things and be like, this is excellent. Okay. And so I think sometimes it's just an exposure.
Right.
And so I'm curious about, you've been cooking professionally at a very high level in Houston now for a couple of decades. And I mean, have you seen a change culturally over that time?
I mean, yes. What's really interesting is it's the older people that want the meat more than the younger. The younger ones are much more open to eating vegetables. And, I always sneak vegetables onto every plate. So even on a lamb plate or one of our thalis that has a lot of meat, there's going to be vegetables. And my waiters will say to me, Anita, no one's eating that fennel. No one's eating that. I'm like, well, tell them that fennel came from a local farm. It's local fennel. It's going to be good for them. And slowly I'm seeing that, fennel salad being eaten, that cabbage salad that's on the side that might look like it's just been placed there. It is something that you can actually eat that and enjoy. It has taste. So I definitely see a shift, and people want to eat more vegetables. I'm convinced of that. Even the older people do. They don't want to give up their meat. The younger people are much more open to just eating food that does not have a lot of meat in it. So, and to me, that's very promising that the younger generation is so much more. When my daughter was married almost 2 years ago, they had a completely vegetarian menu, and I was like, honey, people are coming from all over the world for this wedding. She's like, no animal's going to be killed for my wedding. And I was like, okay, I admired that. I was a little irritated because I really wanted to serve some lobster and lamb chops, but I couldn't. And I kind of admired them for doing it.
I know it is. I completely relate as someone who, cooks at a far lesser level than you ever will, but, who likes to throw a lot of dinner parties. It is like I kind of sit there and I'm like, oh, right, I have a bunch of vegetarians coming over. And it's a little bit of a struggle of like, well, I want to
What
pull
to
out my
serve?
showy dish.
Yeah.
But I think, that work of thinking that, no, these are, the show. These are the main.
Yes, and it is hard. I won't deny that. It is hard to come up with a vegetarian, vegan dish that gives you the satisfaction of meat. So that's the thing. And that's what I work on a lot is what can I make that actually makes me forget meat? Like it is so tasty. And that's been my journey and that's when I decided to take away Meatless Mondays. Like, why don't we spread this wealth around the whole time? Why are we holding on to these dishes for Monday only? So that was why we did that.
I think that's, and even just thinking of, the fact that, your daughter had this vegetarian wedding, it's taking me back to, kind of my last years in Chicago before I moved down to Houston. And, as I said, I grew up in New Orleans, grew up very meat eater. I like my gumbo. I like my
Sure.
jambalaya. Give me some dirty rice. And in Chicago, with a bunch of other kind of, late 20s, early 30s crowd who increasingly returning vegetarian, it really forced me to rethink, not only my diet, but like how I was cooking and how I was interacting with people through food. And so again, it's just, I think there's this cultural component that it's interesting that you mentioned that young people seem more open-minded in this space. Because I think there is this kind of cultural change that's happening that's shifting how we're thinking about it and the expectations around when we're hanging out with people that's just the norm now. We don't hear nearly as many vegan jokes as we did in, say, the early 2000s.
No, that's right. That's right. And I think, veganism is becoming so common. I mean, it's not, and it's not, and I think it's the same thing that you said, you're 90% vegetarian, and if we can all even achieve that, or we can even achieve 50% vegetarianism, the world would be a better place, So it's really about how can you move that needle. It's going to happen slowly. It's not going to happen. And I do that through the food at the restaurant, that how can I serve vegetarian dishes that make people forget about the meat? And I've managed to land on a lot of them, and I'm really proud of that because you can eat those, and a lot of people will tell us that, oh, we only eat vegan at Pondicheri because we know it's going to be the best vegan in town. And I'm like, well, have you tried the lamb chops? They're like, no, we don't need to because we can eat those anywhere. I was like, yeah, but they're really good, So it's really funny having those conversations, but I really am flattered by that because the fact that people know we serve everything and choose to eat vegetarian.
I will say, I've been to your restaurant many times, and it is one of my favorite things there is I can always find great vegetarian food and not have to worry about it. My dad comes, though, he will not give up the meat. So I've tasted some of those wonderful dishes as well.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. It's a generational thing. And I also think the younger generation is aware that what we do matters. Our acts are going to matter to the future of our living and our families. So there's an urgency in kids that was not there in my generation, not in your generation, but hopefully in the younger kids' generation.
That's, really spot on. We're speaking with a variety of some young people who are doing a lot of work in this space next week. So, tune in next week for a conversation with some really incredible young folks who are doing outstanding work around the environment and conservation. I want to pivot slightly and just talk about, I think it's really fascinating that, you run this well-known, well-regarded restaurant in town. You're certainly, hyper-connected in the broader food spaces around Houston. What other initiatives are you doing to try to be a little greener, a little more sustainable in the restaurant? And do you see that as part of a broader trend happening in the industry?
Not in Texas, but I definitely have gone down that path. So when the pandemic happened, I was like, okay, what are we going to do? We're down from 60, 70 employees down to like 5.
Wow.
So we can make some major changes. And I had this guy, things happen in life serendipitously. Somehow this guy passed through my life. He was his name is Leo Brito. He started a company called Zero Waste Houston. He's like, why don't you start composting? I'm like, great idea. And I said, okay, tell me what to do. And he's like, I'll bring you these bins. You put things. And I only had 6. I had like 2 people in the front and 3 in the back. And I was one of them. We're like, okay, well, we're going to put our food in here. We're going to start composting. But they're like, what do you mean composting? I'm like, yeah, we're going to start that. And it was great.
What is composting?
So
Just in case some folks aren't familiar.
So composting is basically throwing all your fruit, vegetable cuttings into a pile and turning that into soil. Now, we don't do the turning it into the soil part. We just compost. So we give those grains or those leftovers, and you can throw anything from rinds, seeds, even meat, skin, bones to a company that turns that into soil. And, it costs us a lot of money, which I feel that whole model needs to change, because we are paying them money so they can make money, off that. But
it's a Texas-wide in particular issue. There are other places where, especially if there are expensive fees for trash collection and things, then composting suddenly becomes the cheap way to save money, right?
Right.
And so you can see in other states, in other countries, Germany is a great example, where people have really turned to composting specifically because it can be a major cost savings.
Right.
And reduces waste. It's less of a, the way we've set up trash collection and trash expenses in Houston and in Texas more broadly, it doesn't work as well, which is, an ongoing frustration. I've heard folks who run these, businesses raise this exact complaint that you're listing of.
Well, our trash has gone down by like 80%.
Wow.
And we started with 6-7 employees. We moved slowly back up to what we have now. And everybody at first was frustrated. And the compost company was charging us money when they found a glove or something that was not meant to be in the compost. And, we had to pay those additional fees for them having to clean out our compost. But now, it's been 4 years now, 4.5 years. I compost at home. I compost at the restaurant, and it's the only way to be. When I tell people that, we even invited a bunch of chefs one time. We're like, come on, let me show you what we do. I walked them through the whole thing, and they were like, great idea. I got a nice pat on the back. I don't know if anybody ever did it. Maybe 1 or 2 people in town. So that disappoints me that not enough people do this. We pay upwards of $2,000 a month, which is a lot of money at the end of the year for this composting program. But it is something that I believe in very deeply. So, and other people are doing it. Definitely not in Houston. In New York, there's a restaurant in London called Silo that I really want to go visit one day. They basically are they've taken it to a new level.
Can you say more about?
Yeah, I mean, they even they recycle their glass and their wine bottles, and they crush them and make plates out of them. They are truly a zero waste facility. It's admirable.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I want to go there for a field trip or send someone there just to spend some time there. It is that amazing. So things can be done, It'd be great to have a community around it. As of now, there isn't one in Houston.
No.
There's people that will compost, but it's a business now.
Yeah.
It's not being done for the right reasons.
Well, and I mean, as you mentioned, it's not just that you're reducing food waste there, but you're also getting soil, which, for our gardeners, for people like me who just love their houseplants, it's really great to have this high quality, fertilized soil essentially that you can use directly.
Well,
and so
we don't get that. That gets sold. So we have to figure out a way to get some of that back.
And this is where that Houston piece really, the conversation, the way that it's structured needs to be rethought, because if you're doing it on your own, you get all these wonderful benefits out of it at home. That you can get this really high quality soil that suddenly becomes something that you can use. So you've taken waste and made it into something really valuable.
And if you I was in Austria a couple of years ago, and they have the containers that they give you for trash if you're in a house or a building. One is called, it's basically what's living. So there's actually a trash pickup for compost there.
Wow.
So imagine if we could get there, if we could just have when you pull out your trash, and I almost never have any trash because I recycle everything I can and I put it in the right, we take our recycling to the right facilities too. So what if we were to have a composting facility citywide? I mean, that would be amazing. We'd have to train people how to do it. It's a lot of learning, but it's doable at home. Once you get into the habit, at home you don't cook that much. Just put your peelings, your cuttings, your meat bones into that. You have less trash. and it's doing something better for the environment.
Yeah, and I love that you're pointing out it becomes second nature, and so many of
Yes.
these things, these small steps that we can take, they absolutely just become second nature once we start becoming aware.
Yeah. And the culture of India has always been that way. I just kind of came to America and got a little sullied by the shininess of everything here. But when I was growing up, my mother would put all the bottles, the soda bottles in one side. She'd stack all the newspapers, everything was separately. Somebody would come pick up the trash, the newspapers. Someone would come pick up these bottles from her. So there was a system there is still a system in India. We never saw plastic. I think one of the worst things you can do is buy plastic. I avoid plastic like you cannot imagine. Like, I will not take grocery bags in stores. Will never take a bag at a grocery store. I'll carry it in my hand if I don't have a bag. Even not taking plastic from stores that you're going to discard within 3 seconds. Why would you take a plastic bag? Like, plastic is so terrible.
Yes.
The pollution of plastic in our oceans is a
remarkable.
whole other subject. I'm sure you know that.
And the production of it, we've done a series of pieces around plastic. We'll have more pieces around plastic and plastic waste coming up as well. So, absolutely. And again,
and this is why I brought my own water bottle, because I will not drink from a plastic water bottle, because it's just not. To me, it doesn't sit right. I'm not going to do it.
No, it's admirable. And it's definitely one of those things that I think, we continue to adjust and think about and a part of a much larger conversation, and absolutely showing how these conversations are always overlapping and interrelated in really important ways. And Chef Anita, we are rapidly running out of time with you. Are there any other major things you'd like to point out to us about things Pondicherry is doing, or maybe what's on the horizon for the restaurant?
No, we have a new spring-summer menu out. It's got lots of vegetables and, some meat. And no, Pondicherry is doing well. We are going to have a big Mother's Day, blowout like we always do. But yeah, no, life is good.
Chef Anita Jaisinghani, thank you so much for joining us and chatting with us about all these various issues. Such a pleasure to speak to you. The restaurant is Pondicherry. If you haven't been, please go. And the book is Masala, which is also fantastic. And so, wonderful Houston food advocate. Wonderful to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Welcome.
We'll go now over to a piece from our researcher, Jaden, who will tell us a little bit about the cost of meat and expand on some of the ideas we've been talking through here.
Hey y'all, I hope you're doing well. If you thought we were done talking about the meat industry, you are sorely mistaken. In today's piece, we'll cover the hidden costs of meat, including subsidies, lobbying, and environmental impacts. To start off, we'll have a brief overview of the meat and dairy subsidies in the U.S., then we'll move towards subsidies and market prices, continuing on to environmental impacts, health implications, and then we'll round out with lobbying and governmental policies. So without any further ado, let's jump in. I'll try to start at the beginning and introduce the concept of direct payment. Essentially what happens here is the federal government provides direct subsidies to livestock farmers, primarily in the form of crop insurance, disaster relief, and payment for specific commodities. For instance, livestock producers receive significant financial assistance to mitigate risks associated with raising animals for meat and dairy production. These payments aim to stabilize farm incomes and ensure food security. In an article published by Purdue, titled The End of the Direct Payment Era in the U.S., Farm Policy, it becomes clear that direct payments were introduced in 1996 with the intention to replace farm programs that artificially supported crop commodity prices above market levels. In the beginning, it was only intended to be a temporary fix until 2002. At that point, direct payments aimed to reorient agricultural markets to supply and demand dynamics, which provide funds to help farmers adjust to market conditions and comply with World Trade Organization rules. However, what actually happened was new subsidies replaced direct payments. This new model resembles ACRE, which was authorized in 2008, linking payments to farm revenue or price benchmarks. Ultimately, the goal of this shift is to revise the model of the 1996 Farm Bill by tying government support to farmers' production decisions and market outcomes. Additionally, we know that the impact of ending direct payments and introducing new subsidies on the farm economy is multifaceted. This now requires farmers to navigate a set of program payments that are tied to their decision and revenue from the most recent crop year. So while in recent years, when researchers explored the potential effects of direct payments on farm decisions and markets, the results are somewhat inconclusive, as they vary widely, indicating a weak link between payment levels and specific impacts due to the program's design. So now, keeping this in mind, let's address subsidies and market prices. In simplest terms, subsidies are financial aids provided by governments to support certain industries, including agriculture. In the case of meat production, subsidies are often given to farmers to lower their cost of production. This can take various forms, such as direct payments, tax breaks, or subsidized loans for purchasing equipment and feed. So, for instance, when subsidies are provided to meat producers, the overall production costs decrease. As a result, meat producers can now afford to sell their products at lower prices while still maintaining profitability. Which on the surface sounds really great to consumers, but we'll get to why that might not be so true later. So how do subsidies reduce market prices of meat products? Well, in an article titled "The True Cost of a Hamburger," it goes into detail regarding the impacts of subsidies. It explains that the United States government annually spends approximately $38 billion to subsidize the meat and dairy industries. In turn, these subsidies directly contribute to reducing the market prices of meat products. We can see how significant the impact is when we look at the price of, let's say a hamburger. Research presented in this article suggests that subsidies drastically reduce the prices of meat products. For instance, the price of a Big Mac reduces from $13 to a mere $5, and the price of a pound of hamburger meat decreases from $30 to also just $5. So yes, let that one sink in for a minute. It doesn't end there either. While everyone lines up to get their $5 1 pound of hamburger meat that really should cost them $30, let's think about how that impacts everyone who is either not consuming meat or consuming infinitely less. Non-meat consumers also bear the environmental costs associated with meat production, such as agricultural land use and livestock farming, which contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions and environmental degradation, impacting everyone regardless of their meat consumption habits. This leads us right into our next section on environmental impacts. So we'll kick this section off with the most obvious impact, the copious amounts of greenhouse gas emissions being released from this industry alone. Meat production from animals like cattle contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. Livestock farming emits methane, a potent greenhouse gas, primarily through enteric fermentation in digestive systems of cattle. Further, the production of feed crops for livestock, such as corn and soybeans, requires intensive agricultural practices that emit carbon dioxide through land use, deforestation, and the use of fertilizers and machinery. It is ultimately these emissions that exacerbate climate change. In a news journal titled "Gigantic Power of Meat Industry Blocking Green Alternatives," it states that livestock production causes 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It goes on to say that cutting meat and dairy consumption also slashes pollution, land and water use, and the destruction of forests, with scientists saying it is the single biggest way for people to reduce their impact on the planet. Another unsurprising environmental impact is habitat loss. With every give, there is also a take, so it shouldn't come as a shock that with the expansion of livestock farming leads to habitat destruction, particularly in regions like the Amazon. Sadly, in order for more cows to be grass-fed, forests are cleared to make room for cattle ranching. When deforestation takes place, it not only destroys critical habitat for countless plants and animal species, but also disrupts ecosystems and contributes to biodiversity loss. If you didn't think that was bad enough, deforestation also releases stored carbon into the atmosphere, further intensifying climate change. Many of you may already know, but the meat industry can actually have adverse effects on your health, causing respiratory issues among others. Those facing the most health challenges are typically the workers. Employees in meat processing facilities are exposed to airborne contaminants and often face inadequate ventilation and safety measures. According to the National Institute of Health, this work can cause musculoskeletal disorders, including both acute injuries and repetitive strain injuries, which are among the most commonly reported problems. Other health hazards include infectious diseases, skin and respiratory disorders, and problems caused by environmental stressors such as cold, heat, noise, chemical exposures, explosions, fires, and work stress. However, those not working in such facilities are also impacted greatly. Typically, low-income communities are disproportionately affected by the siting of meat processing plants and the associated health hazards. Oftentimes, the reason for this is due to a lack of political power to oppose the placement of facilities or to demand stricter environmental regulations, leading to the heightened health risks for residents. This is not to disregard those who live in areas somewhat close to a meat plant, as the intensive nature of meat production and processing facilities often leads to poor air quality in surrounding communities. These facilities emit various pollutants, including ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and particulate matter, which can exacerbate respiratory conditions such as asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. It's incredibly sad to think that many individuals will live the rest of their life with complications due to harmful chemicals and the process employed by these meat manufacturing companies. The only way to change this is through lobbying and government efforts. So before we close out on this chapter of meat, let's talk about that. Despite an abundance of public effort, it's quite hard to make a change in the meat industry when meat production wields significant financial resources, which ultimately enables them to invest heavily in lobbying efforts to help influence government policies and regulations. If that wasn't enough of a dilemma, the issue of subsidies isn't cut and dry either. In fact, while many corporations benefit from subsidies, government officials often also benefit by having a secured vote. It would appear that no matter how many collective public efforts there are to create more regulations in the meat industry, it will prove to be more difficult than anyone anticipated, as it is deeply intertwined with government and politics, and when those are involved, very few ever win. So in closing, we've learned that there's a lot more that is hidden in meat industry than just financials. The aim of this piece is to bring awareness to the meat industry's large impact on the world, ranging from subsidies and market prices to environmental impacts, health implications, and lobbying efforts. Throughout this research, it is evident that the meat industry operates with many interconnected factors that have far-reaching consequences for society, the environment, and public health. Ultimately, while the tasks may seem daunting, it's imperative that we continue to raise awareness and public support to hold policymakers and industry leaders accountable for their actions. So with that, I hope you found this information useful, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.
It's Earth Month, which means there's a lot of things happening all over town all month long. And so 3 of these things. The first is an Earth Day celebration of solutions hosted by Achieving Community Tasks Successfully, or ACTS, at the Woodson Research Center and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies. The conversation is going to take place at the Glasscock School of Continuing Studies at Rice University this Saturday, April 13th from 12 to 3:30. There'll be a range of conversations about food insecurity with multiple featured speakers. And you can register for lunch at the event by visiting events.rice.edu and registering to attend. Next up is a conversation at Rice University on climate migration. Abram Lustgarten, the Pulitzer Prize-nominated journalist and author of the new book On the Move, The Overheating of Earth and the Uprooting of America, will read from his new book and then hold a Q&A. This will be followed by a demonstration of the new Climate Vulnerability Index, a tool that maps out a huge variety of risks to demonstrate which communities are at greatest risk from climate change. And then there'll be a panel of experts discussing these issues. Free copies of Lustgarten's book are available there, and we'll also have Abram on the show in just a few weeks, so you definitely want to check it out. The event's also at Rice. It's the Craft Hall on April 15th at 6 p.m. Go to Rice's Center for Environmental Studies website, enst.rice.edu, for more. And lastly, I'd like to encourage you to go out to Earth Day Houston, hosted by the Citizens Environmental Coalition and Green Mountain Energy. It'll be on April 22nd in Discovery Green from noon to 5 p.m. There'll be dozens of informational booths with lots of ideas for ways to get involved. wild. And also KPFT will be out there. I'll be there, so please stop by and say hi. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we're speaking to American Youth Works about their Youth Climate Corps and how young people are grappling with the climate emergency by getting their hands dirty and facing the problem head on. Lastly, if you've missed any of our episodes and want to catch up, make sure to check out the Gulf Streams podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and Google Play. Podcast episodes are available after the show airs on KPFT every Monday, so if you can't listen live, check us out anytime and make sure to tell your friends and family about their source for environmental news right here in Houston. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave me a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM with Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston.